Friends, before we dive into today's terrifying story, let me share something interesting with you. Almost 80% of the people who watch our videos enjoy them, but haven't subscribed yet. So, if you're one of those 80%, it'll just take a second. Hit that subscribe button below. Photographs allow us to capture moments we want to remember forever. But what if the very pictures you treasure slowly turn into a curse? Dan was a student in his school's basketball team. Technically, he was part of the team, but most of the time he sat on the bench as a substitute. Whether he was there or not made no real difference. Dan lacked confidence, and because of that, his teammates often mocked him. It hurt him deeply, but he never had the courage to stand up for himself. One day, the school arranged an official basketball team photo shoot. A professional photographer took pictures of all the players. The next day, the coach distributed envelopes containing everyone's photographs. When Dan opened his envelope, his hands froze. In the team photo, the spot where Dan had been sitting was completely empty, as if he had never been there at all. Confused and disturbed, Dan went straight to the photographer's studio after school. When he showed the photo to the photographer, even the man looked puzzled. Dan insisted on getting another photograph taken, but the photographer refused, saying he was too busy. Instead, the photographer pulled a cloth aside, opened a hidden safe, and handed Dan a very old, antique camera. Dan couldn't believe his luck. One photograph in exchange for an antique camera felt like a great deal. Thanking the photographer, Dan left happily. As soon as he reached home, Dan began cleaning the camera lens. Suddenly, without him pressing anything, the camera flashed and instantly printed a photograph. The picture showed a boy wearing a t-shirt torn at the shoulder. Dan assumed it was just an old photo left inside the camera. A little later, as Dan walked into his room, a sharp nail sticking out of the door frame ripped his t-shirt at the shoulder. His heart stopped. When Dan looked back at the photograph, he realized the boy in the picture was none other than himself. Before he could process what had happened, Dan's sister arrived home. The camera suddenly clicked again, capturing a photo of a large vase placed in the hall. Seconds later, Dan's sister accidentally bumped into the vase. It fell and shattered on the floor. The photo that came out of the camera showed the same vase lying broken on the ground. Terrified, Dan locked the camera inside his cupboard. The next morning, Dan was changing clothes in the school basketball locker room. When he opened his locker, his blood ran cold. The camera was inside. Before he could react, James walked in. James was a known bully and often targeted Dan. Laughing cruelly, James threw Dan's clothes around the room. Overcome with anger, Dan grabbed the camera and took James's photo. The flash was so bright that James shut his eyes in pain. Dan grabbed his clothes and ran away. Later that day, shocking news spread across the school. After practice, a heavy locker had suddenly fallen on James, breaking his leg. When Dan looked at the photograph, it showed James crushed under the locker. For the first time, Dan smiled. He felt powerful. Now, anyone who mocked him could be punished with just one click. But this power didn't last long. One evening, Dan was examining the camera when his younger sister sat beside him. He jokingly told her that the camera was magical and that whoever was photographed would suffer something terrible. She laughed and mocked him. Suddenly, the camera flashed on its own and took her picture. Panicked, Dan shoved his sister aside. She yelled at him, but at that exact moment, a heavy ceiling fixture crashed down right where she had been standing. The photograph showed her lying injured beneath it. Terrified, Dan decided to return the camera to the photographer. When he reached the studio, he was shocked. The place had completely changed. Professional shoots were happening, and the photographer, who once wore old clothes, was now dressed in an expensive suit. The photographer ignored Dan at first. When Dan grabbed his hand and demanded answers, the man pulled him aside. For 10 years, that cursed camera brought me nothing but misery, the photographer said. The moment it left me, my luck changed. I didn't give you the camera, he whispered. The camera chose you. He revealed that every photograph taken with the camera carried a devil's mark. The camera granted power, but the price was paid with the owner's fate. Horrified, Dan rushed home. At the door, he saw his parents leaving for a movie. Suddenly, the camera clicked again, taking their picture. Before Dan could stop them, they drove away. A photo printed out showing their car flipped upside down on the road. Dan tried calling them, but there was no answer. In desperation, he smashed the camera with a bat. But when he returned inside, the camera lay perfectly intact in the middle of the room. Running out of time, Dan had one final idea. He placed a large mirror in front of the camera and used a stick to press the shutter from behind the sofa. As soon as the photo was taken, a horrifying noise filled the room. The camera burst into flames, as if something inside it was screaming and burning. Minutes later, Dan's phone rang. It was his father. They had narrowly escaped a deadly accident. Relieved, Dan and his sister hugged each other, believing the nightmare was finally over. But they failed to notice one thing. In the corner of the mirror stood the same devil's mark that appeared in every photograph. The curse wasn't gone. If you like the story, please subscribe Mythscape.